very basic concept of NMR, as you know, any positive spin in the presence of a strong magnetic field will either align itself parallel to the magnetic field or anti-parallel to the magnetic field. So here's your main magnetic field V0, and that's your spin. And this is the spin we're talking about the protons in. So any proton with an odd number of weight will exhibit the phenomenon of NMR, as you know. And in the human body, it is primarily the hydrogen protons we're talking about, because that's the most abundant proton. We do also have carbon-12, but because it has even number, so you won't see that. So we are talking about 1H protons. So the 8 hydrogen protons are either parallel or anti-parallel to the field, but they are also precessing around in its own axis, and that's called the precessional frequency. Okay. So here, just demonstrating the same principle in terms of energy levels. So once again, you have the spins that are in the lower energy state will obviously align, will occupy the lower energy state, which is more stable. But however, some of them would also occupy the higher energy state or the anti-parallel state. At this point, there is no signal. In order to generate a signal, you have to give energy. That is the law of energy. So energy in NMR is given through what we call is the radio frequency. So you give a radio frequency pulse, and you basically force some of these lower energy states to an unstable high energy state. So, and that's what we're doing here. The energy is given, or the RF is given only for a few microseconds. It's not given for long. As soon as you release that, obviously these pins would want to come back to the steady state level. And that's precisely what happens. Now, these pins are coming back to the state, and they come through two mechanisms, because these are time mechanisms. One is called the T1 time, the other is called the T2 time. I'll come about these in a second. However, when you flip this, that is where, when you give it frequency, that is when you are moving the net magnetization from the z-axis to the xy plane. As soon as it is in the xy plane, that is where the receiver signal sees the most signal. You remove the RF, and the signal decays. In what we call as the pre-induction decay, it is an exponential decay. And that is your primary NMR signal. You do a Fourier transformation of that, and you get your classical NMR spectrum in the frequency domain, which you all are very familiar with. If it is a very single compound, you just get one signal. If it is a mixture, you get more complicated FIDs, and you get signals accordingly. Biological samples will have a very complicated FID, and then you get the spectrum, which is reflects, as you know very well, the x-axis is the chemical shift, and the y-axis reflects the concentration of the metabolite. So I'm sure this is all very familiar to you already. So now going to MRI. So how does MRI work? So basically, now I have 3 tubes filled with water. If I were to do the exact experiment that I did before, that is put them in the magnetic field and give an RF and then do the Fourier transformation, since they are all plain water, pure water, I will just get one signal. Okay. So even though I get the signal, it does not tell me the signal comes from tube A, B, or C. So how do I get that? Well, how about if I change the magnetic field slightly so that the 3 tubes get different magnetic fields? And I do that by implying a gradient. So this is an external magnetic field, which now goes from the negative to the positive. magnetic fields experienced by the three tumors. If I do that, I will now get three signals. It's very simple mechanism. Now this I'm showing you in one dimension. You can think of it in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and hence you get the spatial information. So coming back to, okay, so we got the spatial information, but how do we get the contrast? So here's the MRI image of the human brain, and the same image, but one is called the T2 relaxation, one is the T1. So what is happening, if you remember I just said before, that this relaxation, when the spins come back, they come in 2 states, which we call the T2 relaxation, and the other is called the T1 relaxation. T1 relaxation, when the spins want to go back to the z-axis, and the T2 relaxation is the process of phase decay. Every single biological tissue has its own characteristic T2 and T1. So water will have a very long T2 and a very long T1. And hence water will appear bright. So this is the brain. You have in the brain, you probably know from your anatomy courses, it has gray matter, white matter, and the cerebral spinal fluid of the CSF. If you take the T2 weighted image, it will appear like that. If you flip the acquisition parameters, you will get an image like that. So this Rubik's cube here is basically showing you the 3-dimensional spatial information, which I explained to the gradients in the slide before, and now it's showing the contrast. Okay, so we got the contrast, we got the spatial information. Now coming to the brain side, can we adjust the display of it? Because it seems that lots of it's very. So coming to brain tumors, so why brain tumors? What is so important about it? I think the resolution will come to you. Okay. Now I'm just showing the stats from the UK, but this is globally true. Brain tumors, especially in adults, and especially the most lethal form, glioblastoma. It occurs primarily after the age of 60 in humans. It is the 9th most cause of death in the UK. Incidences have been increasing since the 90s. Nobody knows why, but that is the data out there. It has very, very poor survival. Once it's diagnosed, people die within 14 to 16 months of the initial diagnosis. Because the survival is so poor, you obviously need better methods to detect it fast, better methods to treat it. What is the current way of diagnosing it? Something is inside the brain. You cannot take a biopsy so easily. You can. So histology is the gold standard. You take the tissue out and you do immunohistochemistry, and you characterize the tumor and you say, well, that is what it is. But that's already too late. You are drilling a hole, taking the tissue out of the brain. That is so invasive. You can do imaging, CT scan, easily available, quite cheap. The trouble is that the contrast is not very good. It will not tell you the extent of the tumor. You can do PET, which is positron emission tomography, which relies on glucose uptake. The trouble is that the brain gets 99% of its energy through glucose. So hence the background is so bright that if the tumor is slightly brighter, you can't really tell the difference. And hence MRI is the modality of choice these days throughout the world. What is the current practice? You have somebody with a patient with an MRI, brain tumor, suspected brain tumor, will get a T2 weighted image, a T1 weighted image, they will get a flare and a post-contrast scene. Without getting into the details of what these are, basically I told you that the relaxation parameters are different. You give a contrast dye, and the dye makes the tumor appear bright. So if you see a bright spot, you say, oh, that's a tumor. But that's not really the case because this brightness only shows the breakage of the blood-brain barrier. So if you have any other pathology and the blood-brain barrier is broken, it will still show bright. Okay. So you have the limitations are you cannot tell whether it's tumor versus infection. You cannot tell whether it's high grade or low grade. Or you cannot even tell whether after treating, whether it's treatment responses are being done. And especially the cases where the tumor does not even enhance with cavity. So it can't really clear. So that's where my research begins, and that's where some story begins to happen. So there's much more to MR than only showing anatomy. I already mentioned NMR spectroscopy. Okay. So, however, unlike MRI, which you predominantly look at the water in the brain, MR spectroscopy, and just to tell you, this is MRS, NMR, MRI, they're all same. It's just that in the early days, the clinicians got so scared of the word nuclear magnetic resonance that they thought that we were injecting something nuclear. So hence, the community finally dropped the N from it. So it becomes magnetic resonance. But it is still NMR. But here what we're looking at with the MRS is the metabolites. And in the brain, the most abundant is the MS-aspartate, which is the neuronal marker. We have creatine, which is the marker of energy. Another one, choline, which is a marker of membrane synthesis. In cancer, because the cells are rapidly dividing, choline goes up. Again, if the tumor cells are dividing and rapidly growing, the neurons will die, and hence the NAA goes down. Lactate and lipid go up because they are marker of glycolysis. This is the work from my PhD. So way back then, we had already demonstrated that that's your normal brain spectrum. And if you have a pathology, whether it's a benign tumor or a malignant tumor, they look completely different than the normal. Not only that, they also look completely different than a brain abscess or a TB in the brain. Tuberculosis will only have lipids. Abscess will have amino acids, valine, leucine, acetate, alanine, succinate, versus the tumors will have higher choline. Another feature of GBM is what we call as transformation. When initially the tumor starts as a low grade, benign tumor, and you say, oh, it's a low grade, we can take our time to treat it. At some point it transforms to higher grade. And that's called secondary tumor. It's noted that a mutation in the gene called isocitrate dehydrogenase is the reason. And that mutation leads to an increase in the metabolite called 2-hydroxygluconate. So this is your PCA cycle. Glucose comes to pyruvate, acetylcholine, and into cycle. If the IDH is not mutated, that is, this cycle is coming from citrate, succinate, and lactate. If there is a mutation in this, you will get an accumulation of alpha-ketoglutarate, and from there an accumulation of 2-hydroxyglutarate. Again, if you know the NMR structure of 2-hydroxyglutarate, it is the multiplate of multiplets. There is a cell line with the mutation, and you clearly see that the peaks match. The cell line without the mutation does not match. So it becomes a characteristic peak. However, because it is a multiplet of multiplets, it's not easy to see in the brain with 1D NMR. And that is why you have to do a 2D NMR. This is a spectrum of 2D coding. And here you clearly see the peaks of 2-hydroxyglutarate separate from glutamine transaction, which if you did a 1D NMR, you would just have it along with the diagnosis, and hence you would not be able to have it. This is a tumor which does not have a mutation, and we do not see the tumor disease. The trouble with 2D NMR in vivo in humans is that it takes much longer. It is much low, since the sensitivity is low, and hence this study was done or published at 7 Tesla rather than the chemical brackets of 3 Tesla, which are used more strongly. The next thing that MR can do is what we call as dynamic contrast analysis. So we still use the dye, but rather than giving the injection and waiting for it to accumulate, we rapidly image it. And if we do that, because that can help us to assess hypoxia and blood flow. Tumors are hypoxic, and hence, because as the tumor grows, that's the blood vessel, the further the cells are away from it. So these cells closer will have the proper blood supply, they're oxic. Further down, they become hypoxic, and the central become lymphatic. So if we did do this dynamic contrast enhanced MRI, say it's moving here. I don't think I can put this, probably need to replace there. So you see that the image of the brain is dark, and as contrast comes in, the tumor becomes brighter and brighter. And this is the signal from the vessel. We fit this data into the mathematical formulations, and we get blood. Once we have this data, time intensity domain data, we can measure the blood flow. Another method, similar one, but now using a PT star, and this time, rather than blood flow, it gives you the value of blood volume. Tumors in general will have higher blood volume and will be very, very leaky. So here's an example of how we use this. So a patient with glioblastoma or DBM versus a patient with metastasis. Standard MRI will not tell the difference. This perfusion MRI shows that much higher blood volume, not only just in the periphery of the tumor, but further away as well. The reason for that is that glioblastomas are very, very invasive. Metastatic tumors, on the other hand, are not invasive. They will become like a sphere if you are in India. So here, if you see, the blood flow in the tumor is high, but the blood flow outside of the tumor is low. And hence I can tell the difference. Next thing is diffusion spectrography. Basically, again, using the properties of diffusion MRI. So if the signal is taken along this orientation, the diffusion would be high. If the signal is taken along XY position, the signal will be low, the diffusion will be low. Using these properties, I can create what is called is white matter pattern. We know in the brain, it's white matter and a gray matter. The white matter is basically the connections of the axons, versus the gray matter is the neurons. The axons will process signals from one part of the brain to the body. And hence, they are very, very important for any function, speech, vision, motion. So here, there's the tumor, and there is the white matter tract right here. अगर ये इंफॉर्मेशन न्यूरोसर्जन के पास नहीं होगी, वो ट्यूमर काटने लगेगा or you might not have it again. So this information becomes very, very important. So that is why nowadays pre-operative spectrography, most neurosurgeons will always do right now. And once they know, they will plan the surgery so that they can take as much tumor out without cutting the white matter. In this case, actually, the surgeon was unable to, and he did cut out some of the white matter, and the patient ended up with a visual field. He was unable to see. So in the big centers, big academic centers like EGI and AIMS and others, this is now become the standard practice. So conventional MRI, they said T1, T2, and that's it. Versus now, you do everything, T1, T2, diffusion, perfusion, spectroscopy, add all the information, and then take it. So that's what we do. We also need to know, that was the diagnosis part. What about treatment? Trouble is that despite doing aggressive treatment, as I said, survival is low. However, in about a third of the cases, MRI shows contrast enhancement within 6 months after radiation. And we don't know whether it is the tumor coming back or is it the effect of radiation. And if you don't know the answer, the problem is for the patient that if it is only a radiation response, the poor patient will get a second biopsy, which is not necessary. If it is not a response, if the tumor has come back, you need to do an early intervention. Or if it is a mixed response, you need to keep on following. And the standard MRI cannot do that. Even for the radiologist, the workload is quite high. Because if सारा सब कुछ करेंगे, it's much more work. So that's where we thought, okay, we can probably contribute with our research. So we do this diffusion and perfusion imaging, multi-parametric, and we publish this many, many times. We do the standard statistics, and if you look at a single parameter by itself, there's not much difference except for one or two parameters. But if you do a multi-parametric analysis using more statistical regression analysis, AUC, or what we call it, sensitivity, goes more than 90%. And that really helps the patient. So here's another example of NMR or spectroscopy. So rather than taking signal from one box, we try to get the information from the entire thing. Here's the image, and here is the T2. We match the two. Then we segment the contrast enhancing and the non-enhancing regions. Then we take our metabolite map and we overlay on top of the image. And we can take the MR spectrum on whichever region we want. And we can average it and then get the information showing the difference between the cloning to MAA, between the pseudo progression, true progression versus the true progression, confirmed by histology. And here's the example. So basically, अगर ट्यूमर वापस आया है तो cloning ज़्यादा होगा, radiation response है तो cloning कम होगा. And that's precisely what we should. Another aspect, we need new drugs. In this era, drugs are very, very, very expensive. Even if you do synthetic organic chemistry, we all know from the first synthesis in the lab to the market, it can take about 15 to 20 years. In the age of biologics, the expenses go even more. A perfect example of brain tumors is bevacizumab, a drug that takes about $20,000 per injection. We don't want to waste that drug in a patient that does not respond. And that's why you need it. But you also need animal models. need to test it before you even get to the patient. There are several models available. We work on all. And then similarly for the MRI, we have several applications. Typical example of what we do in my lab. We inject the tumor cells in the lab brain, and we will take longitudinal MRI after injection of the tumor cells, and then we will do different kinds of MRI experiments, whether diffusion, whether conductivity MR, spectroscopy, whatever you name it, when we do it. And then we confirm the findings with the cell. Okay. So here's one example again about what I already mentioned, the tumors. They have high choline. Why? Because choline is the major component of the cell membrane. And if you look at the Kennedy pathway, the free choline that you eat from your diet is phosphorylated to phosphocholine, to CDP-choline, phosphatidylcholine, and that is what you need for your cell. So the more malignant the tumor, the higher the choline. And hence, if you block this pathway, that might be a way to treat the tumor. And that's precisely what we did. So we have a drug that blocks the choline kinase. So here's the tumor in the rat brain. Spectrum before treatment, after treatment, you clearly see a drop in choline. So now you have a very, very specific NMR marker of treatment response. So it's not just in one animal model, it's not just with one drug. So this was a drug called L-15B. This is another drug called Gas-59, or more recent one, and this is in a mouse, and very, very similar to those. And this drug, at least the L-15B, did reach clinical trials as well. So there is a lot of promise in that. Not only did we see a lot decrease in choline with the treated tumors, but it also masked with decreased cell proliferation. So it did not really kill the cells, but it just stopped tumors from growing. You can also detect apoptosis. I'm not sure whether you know, the cells can die by two mechanisms. One is apoptosis, one is necrosis. So the apoptotic pathway, that too has a marker, and it is the presence of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So as you know, in NMR, you get both saturated fatty acids, so these are saturated fatty acids, CH3 terminal and CH2N. Unsaturated fatty acids are 2.8 and 5.2. So once again, why I keep on saying this, you all know it. So you can relate to this, how important and useful it is. So this, we had proposed this way back during my postdoc days in Finland, and that is how it continues to be the case even today. And again, with treatment, we see this massive increase in the polyunsaturated fatty acids. More recently, we have done this DCE MRI, and now we're not only looking at the blood flow, but the heterogeneity in blood flow. As the tumor grows, so this is grade 8, grade 11, grade 13, you see not only the tumor becomes larger, but the center becomes more necrotic and more hypoxic. Not only can we look at the permeability, we can look at other parameters as well. And that again becomes quite important. This is the last I know of a couple slides of my lecture. Now, doing animal models is important, that's the way things go. But at least in the Western world, there is more and more push towards doing away with animals. People are becoming quite sensitive about the use of animals in research. So what we have most recently started is using the chicken egg, or the hen's egg rather, as to develop a model of cancer. So this is a sketch diagram of a hen's egg at day 14. So you can clearly, actually this is day 7 or 8. You can see the egg yolk, the embryo. And what is most important to us, so there is this membrane called the CAM, or the chorioallantoic membrane. Just underneath the membrane are these very, very dense vascular structures. So if I cut out the eggshell, put the tumor cells here, within 1 or 2 days, I will get a tumor. And that tumor will be fed by these vessels, precisely what happens in the humans, or precisely what happens in the humans. So now I have created an alternative model of the cancer, which is much cheaper. Buying an egg is much cheaper than buying a mouse. Much faster. It takes only 2 to 3 days to grow the tumor, versus the mouse can sometimes take 6 months to 8 months or even a year. And high throughput. Plus, the most important feature that I am very interested in is the role or the interrelationship between cancer and the host vasculature. Because in the human, it is the host vasculature that is feeding. So we've not only developed that model, so basically what we do, we get the fertilized egg. On day 3, we create a window by cutting out the eggshell. We implant tumor cells on day 7. And by day 14, the tumor is weekly in this way. And we do imaging in the tumor. So here is the MRI image. This is a 9.4 Tesla magnet, very high field magnet. The tumor is right there at the top of the membrane. If I zoom in, that's the tumor, that's the vessel, and the vessel is feeding the tumor. I can process the data, and I can quantify the number of vessels, the thickness of vessels, I can measure the tumor volume and things like that. And you can clearly see that if I measure the blood vessel volume, it's higher in the tumor than in the control. And the last slide, going back to metabolism again, I told you that tumors prefer glycolysis over oxidative phosphorylated. And that means if you look at the spectrum of the tumor, you should see higher lactate. So here is the voxel placed on top of the tumor, and you see the signal from lactate. So this is a specialized pulse sequence. That's why the signal to noise is not very high, but it's very, very specific. You only see lactate, you don't see anything else, because we are using multiple quantum coherence patterns. Control egg, when there is no tumor, you don't see it. A tumor where the cells were growing in the normal conditions, you see higher lactate. A tumor when the cells were grown in hypoxic conditions, you get even higher lactate. So we are very excited about this project. My PhD student is currently working on it, and hopefully we should be able to publish this pretty soon. So in summary, I think I've shown you that MRI is a very versatile tool, and it permits more accurate diagnosis using all these various methods. That it allows you to differentiate between tumor recurrence versus response. That preclinical MRI is very relevant and helps development of novel drugs. And of course, the chicken embryo model is a high throughput model, which gives you assessment of host vasculature and tumor metabolism. With that, I'd like to end my talk and acknowledge all the outstanding students that I've had, the postdoc students as well as PhD students. Jean Kim, Jean, Claire, Jean and Jean are my former postdocs, as well as Sanjeev and Sumay and Gaurav. Claire and Ron are my current and former PhD students, and my collaborators from the University of Pennsylvania. The Center for Preclinical Imaging, that with all the multiple imaging modalities that we have, I only spoke about MRI.